The ledger lay open across the plantation desk, its pages turned yellow from age and the thick Louisiana humidity. But it wasn't the records of cotton harvests or tobacco revenues that caused the overseer's hand to tremble as he brought his lantern closer. It was a separate column, one he'd been told to keep hidden from casual observation. A column tracking something nobody dared speak of openly, yet everybody had started to notice. The entries now stretched back 7 years, each more unsettling than the one before. Blue eyes, blonde hair, skin that only darkened slightly as these children grew older. All born to enslaved women scattered across 3 Louisiana parishes. Different mothers in every case, all bearing children who resembled neither their mothers nor their recorded fathers, nor anyone else living in the quarters. And the whispers had begun. Whispers that moved from plantation to plantation along the Mississippi, carried by traders and escaped slaves, by house servants who caught fragments of their masters' worried conversations, by midwives who had delivered these inexplicable babies and felt something cold move through their blood. Because someone was fathering these children, someone who passed unseen, someone who left behind no trace except the undeniable evidence written across the faces of infants who had no business existing. Before we go further into Louisiana's most disturbing secret, make sure you've subscribed to this channel and turned on that notification bell so stories like this never pass you by. And I want to hear from you. Drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. Now let's pull back the curtain on what truly unfolded in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. This mystery would consume 7 full years, tear apart families, cut short lives, and expose a truth so deliberate and cruel that even hardened plantation owners would find it difficult to comprehend. But in 1837, when the first of these children entered the world, nobody yet grasped what they were witnessing. What started as a single unexplained anomaly would evolve into a pattern so deeply disturbing that it would shake the foundations of Louisiana's plantation society, expose the darkest recesses of a system constructed on human bondage, and demonstrate how power could be exercised with complete impunity when the law itself existed to shield the perpetrator. Louisiana in the late 1830s was a land of contradictions taken to their extremes. New Orleans prospered as one of America's wealthiest cities, its port receiving sugar, cotton, and enslaved people by the thousands. The French and Spanish colonial influences continued shaping the culture, the architecture, the very language spoken out in the streets. Creole French blended with English, Spanish, and African tongues to produce a linguistic tapestry found nowhere else on earth. The city's theaters hosted opera and ballet performances. Its restaurants served food that could rival anything in Paris. Its ballrooms gleamed beneath chandeliers shipped over from Europe. But beyond those gas lights and grand homes, beyond the carefully tended gardens and the elegant facades, the plantation economy held absolute authority. The parishes stretching north of New Orleans, St. James, St. John the Baptist, and Ascension, formed the core of sugar country. These weren't the sprawling cotton operations of Mississippi or Alabama, where enslaved people toiled in relative isolation across vast tracts of land. Sugar cultivation demanded different labor, different timing, and a different kind of brutality. The sugar cane had to be cut and processed within a tight window before the first frost could ruin the crop. This meant that from October through December, the grinding season, every plantation transformed into a factory running around the clock. Enslaved people worked shifts stretching 18, 20, sometimes 22 hours straight. They cut cane in the fields beneath the November sun, hauled it to the sugar houses, fed it into grinding mills, boiled the extracted juice in massive kettles, stirred the crystallizing sugar, and packed it into hogsheads for shipping. The machinery was merciless. The mills could snag clothing, hair, or limbs, dragging workers into the grinding rollers before anyone could react. The kettles of boiling cane juice could splash without warning, causing burns that went through to the bone. Exhaustion led to accidents, to mistakes, to deaths that were entered into ledgers as straightforward property losses calculated against the harvest's profit margin. The mortality rate among enslaved people working Louisiana sugar plantations was the highest anywhere in the American South. Owners were aware of this. They factored it into their business calculations. It was more economical to work people until they died and purchase replacements than to maintain any sustainable pace of labor. This was the world into which those strange children would be born. A world where human beings had been reduced to units of production, where their bodies belonged to someone else, where the law extended them no protection and no recourse whatsoever. The parishes were densely settled compared to other plantation regions. Properties sat pressed close together along the riverbanks, their boundaries often separated by nothing more than a line of cypress trees or a narrow bayou. The river itself served as highway, lifeline, and connector between plantations. Steamboats moved up and down its length constantly, carrying goods, mail, passengers, and news. Information moved fast in this environment. A birth on one plantation would be common knowledge on 3 others by the following morning. A death, a sale, a punishment, all became widely known almost immediately. This interconnectedness made the mystery all the more troubling, because when these unusual births began occurring, they didn't happen in isolation. They formed a pattern, and patterns implied intention. The first plantation to record such a birth was Bellamont, a mid-sized sugar operation belonging to the Duchamp family, who had held the land for 3 generations, going back to the Spanish colonial period. The main house was built in the Creole style, raised on brick pillars against flooding, with wide galleries wrapping around both floors. Moss-draped oak trees lined the drive down from the river road. Behind the main house, the sugar works spread outward. The mill building, the boiling house, the curing sheds, the cooperage where barrels were made. Further back, beyond a screen of trees, sat the quarters. 2 rows of cabins facing one another across a dirt path. Each cabin housed multiple families, sometimes as many as 10 or 12 people in a single room. There was no privacy, no space, no comfort. Only survival. The Duchamp household consisted of Monsieur Philip Duchamp, his wife Celeste, and their 3 children. Philip was 48 years old in 1837, a thin, anxious man who had inherited the plantation from his father and managed it in a state of perpetual worry. He fretted over crop yields, over sugar prices, over competition from Cuban imports, over the loans he'd taken out to expand his operations. He worried about slave uprisings, about abolitionists, about the shifting political climate that threatened the entire system his wealth depended upon. His overseer, Vincent Habert, was 32 years old and had been working at Bellamont for 6 years. Habert was unusual among men in his profession. He could read and write fluently in both French and English. He maintained meticulous records. He had earned a reputation for being firm without being gratuitously cruel, for getting results through organization rather than terror. This made him genuinely valuable to Duchamp, who lacked the stomach for the violence that many plantation owners considered a basic management tool. Habert lived in a small house positioned between the main residence and the quarters, placed so that he could keep watch over both. He rose before dawn every single day, made his rounds, assigned work details, tracked progress, and recorded everything in his ledgers. He knew every enslaved person on the plantation by name, their skills, their weaknesses, their family ties. That knowledge was power, and Habert wielded it with care. It was Habert who first noticed the anomaly in March of 1837. And it was Habert who would spend the next 7 years attempting to make sense of what it meant. The child arrived just before dawn on March 14, 1837, delivered by an elderly enslaved midwife named Josephine, who had brought more than 200 babies into the world across her 60-odd years of life. Josephine had been born in Senegambia, before the Revolution, before the colony became Haiti. She'd been brought to Louisiana as a young woman, and had outlasted everything. The transition from French to American rule, multiple changes of ownership, the deaths of her own children, the endless grinding labor of sugar harvest season. She'd encountered every complication, every variation, every tragedy that childbirth could produce. Breech births, stillbirths, mothers who bled out on the cabin floor, infants born too early to survive, twins entangled with one another, infections that turned to killing fever. She had learned to keep her expression neutral, to let nothing show, to simply do the work, and move to the next crisis. But when she cleaned the newborn girl and examined her features by lamplight, she experienced something that rarely visited her anymore. Genuine fear. The mother was a woman named Marie. Dark-skinned, strong, 23 years old. She had been born on Bellemont and had known no other life. Her own mother had died in the sugar house when Marie was 12. Caught by the grinding mill, her screams ending abruptly as the machinery pulled her in. Marie had been standing 10 feet away, frozen, unable to help, unable to do anything but watch. After that day, Marie had grown quiet. She spoke only when necessary, kept her eyes cast down, performed her work without complaint. She had been paired with a man named Thomas when she turned 18, an arrangement made by Habert to produce children who would become plantation property. Thomas was a field hand, strong and dependable, 25 years old. They shared one corner of a cabin with 3 other families. Marie had already given birth to one child, a boy named Jack, now 4 years old. He resembled both his parents. Dark skin, dark eyes, tightly coiled hair. Healthy, bright, already being prepared for field work. This second child should have looked the same. Every expectation, every understanding of how traits passed from parents to children, every observation of how children resembled the people who made them suggested this baby would come into the world with dark skin, dark eyes, and dark hair. Instead, when Josephine wiped away the birth fluids and held the infant up to the lamp, she found pale skin, hair so blonde it was nearly white, and eyes the color of a clear winter sky. Josephine wrapped the child quickly, her mind racing. She had heard stories, of course, handed down through generations of older midwives. Stories about children born looking different from their parents, explained away through distant ancestry, through bloodlines carrying hidden traits from centuries past. The old women spoke of how African peoples had mixed with Arab traders, with Portuguese sailors, with the many different peoples who had crossed the continent over hundreds of years. Sometimes those far-off mixtures resurfaced, they said, producing a child with lighter skin or a different curl pattern. But this was something else entirely. This wasn't a slightly lighter complexion or a looser wave in the hair. This child appeared as though she had been born to a Swedish immigrant, not to Marie. The features were completely European. The narrow nose, the thin lips, the bone structure of the face. When Marie saw her daughter, she said nothing. She simply stared, her exhaustion replaced by something different. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. Her hands trembled as she took the baby, and Josephine watched tears begin sliding silently down her face. "Does she look like anyone you know?" Josephine asked quietly, a question carrying far more weight than its simple words contained. Marie's silence was answer enough. She pulled her daughter close and rocked slightly, and in her face Josephine read a grief so total, it seemed to fill every corner of the small cabin. Thomas arrived an hour later, coming in from the fields where he'd been working the overnight shift during grinding season. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the child, his face emptying out with shock. "That's not mine," he said flatly. "She is yours." Marie whispered. "She is. Look at her. Look at her and tell me that's my child. Marie, please." "Who was it?" His voice was climbing now. "Dangerous." "No one," Marie said, her voice fracturing. "I swear to you, no one. I don't understand this. I don't understand." Josephine stepped between them. "This happens sometimes," she said, though she didn't believe it herself. "Old blood coming through. Ancestors from long ago." Thomas stared at the baby, then at Marie, then at Josephine. Then he turned and walked out of the cabin without another word. By midday, everyone on Belmont knew about the birth. News spread through the quarters the way fire moves through dry grass. People came to see for themselves, crowding into the cabin, staring at the impossible child. Some whispered about curses, about spirits, about divine punishment. Others stayed silent, their faces troubled, as though they understood something they couldn't or wouldn't say aloud. By evening, the news had reached 2 neighboring plantations, carried by enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, by traders who stopped at multiple landings along the river, by the invisible web of communication that existed beneath the visible surface of plantation society. By the end of the week, Vincent Habert had been summoned to the main house to account for the situation to Monsieur Duchamp. He walked up the oak-lined drive feeling dread settle into his chest. He had already questioned Marie. Gently at first, then with growing pressure. She had insisted she'd been with no one but Thomas. She had sworn it, even as tears ran freely down her face, even as she held her strange-looking daughter. He'd questioned Thomas, who refused to acknowledge the child as his and requested reassignment to a different work crew. He'd spoken to the other enslaved people who shared the cabin and might have witnessed something. No one offered any information, or if they possessed any, they were keeping it firmly to themselves. Duchamp was pacing his study when Habert arrived, his thin face pinched tight with worry. The room smelled of pipe tobacco and old books. A portrait of Duchamp's father watched from above the fireplace, stern and judgmental. "Sit down, Habert. Tell me what happened." Habert sat in the chair across from Duchamp's desk and laid out the facts as he understood them. The birth, the child's appearance, Marie's insistence that she had been with no one but Thomas. The absence of any evidence or testimony pointing elsewhere. "It's not possible," Duchamp said, resuming his pacing. "Thomas is the father. It's in the records. I have the breeding records right here." He pulled out a ledger and flipped through the pages. Marie and Thomas paired in 1832. First child born 1833. This is the second. Thomas is the father. "Yes, sir," Habert replied carefully. "That's what the records show. But the child, I don't care what the child looks like." Duchamp cut him off, his voice sharpened by anxiety. "There's an explanation. There must be mixed ancestry, perhaps, something distant. These things happen. Sir, I've seen children born with mixed ancestry. This is different. This child looks entirely European." Duchamp stopped pacing and fixed his gaze on Habert. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, sir. I'm simply reporting what I've observed. Because if you're suggesting that someone, that one of us..." Duchamp couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. The implication was too dangerous, too scandalous. "I'm not suggesting anything," Habert said again. "I'm asking what you want me to do." Duchamp lowered himself heavily into his chair. He looked suddenly older, more worn down. Record the birth. Note the unusual appearance. But the father of record remains Thomas. Is that understood? Yes, sir. And Habert, I don't want this discussed. Not with the other overseers, not with anyone. It's a private matter. An anomaly. Nothing more. Yes, sir. Habert left the main house with a troubled mind. He understood Duchamp's position well enough. Any suggestion that a white man had fathered a child with an enslaved woman would be scandalous, but it wouldn't be unprecedented. Such things occurred, even if they were almost never acknowledged in the open. The real problem was the implication of force, of violation, because Marie insisted she had been with no one but Thomas, which meant that if the child wasn't Thomas's, then something had been done to Marie against her will. And if that was true, if someone had violated an enslaved woman on Duchamp's property, it raised serious questions about security, about oversight, about the kind of order that was supposed to govern every aspect of plantation life. It implied that someone had been moving through the quarters, accessing the women, without detection or consequence. Habert returned to his house and opened his personal journal, separate from the official plantation records. He wrote down everything he knew: the birth, Marie's account, the child's appearance. He dated the entry carefully. March 14, 1837. He had no way of knowing that this would be the first of many such entries, that he was recording the opening chapter of something that would occupy the next 7 years of his life. The child was named Claire. Marie tried to care for her, tried to love her, but the baby was a constant reminder of something Marie could neither explain nor escape. Thomas never acknowledged Claire as his daughter. He avoided Marie, avoided the cabin, avoided even letting his gaze fall on the child when their paths crossed. Eventually, he requested a transfer to a different plantation, and Duchamp granted it, relieved to be rid of one more source of tension. Claire grew. She was a healthy baby who hit all the expected milestones, but her appearance became more remarkable with each passing month. Her hair came in thick and blonde. Her eyes stayed that startling shade of blue. Her skin remained pale, burning quickly under the Louisiana sun. By the time she was 6 months old, she looked like a Nordic child who had somehow been placed among the cabins of a Louisiana plantation. The contrast between her appearance and her surroundings was impossible to ignore. And then, 14 months after Claire's birth, it happened again. The second birth took place at a plantation called Riverside, 6 miles upriver from Belmont. Riverside was a larger operation, more acreage under cultivation, a larger enslaved population. Its owner was a man named Eden Browsard, 55 years old, a second-generation Louisiana planter whose family had built its wealth in the sugar trade. Browsard was known for running a profitable operation. He was also known for his temper, for his readiness to use violence as a management tool, for his conviction that enslaved people needed to be kept in a constant state of fear in order to remain productive. His overseer, Gideon Frost, shared this philosophy entirely. Frost was 40 years old, a transplant from Virginia who had come to Louisiana seeking opportunity. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered by years of sun and wind. He kept a whip coiled at his belt and used it without hesitation. The enslaved people at Riverside feared him, and Frost took that fear as confirmation that he was doing his job correctly. The mother was a woman named Deline, 20 years old, who worked in the main house as a laundress. She had been selected for this position because of her quiet manner, her efficiency, her mastery of the art of being present without being noticed. House servants had to develop this skill, the ability to move through rooms without drawing attention, to hear conversations without seeming to listen. Deline had been born on a plantation in the Natchez district and sold to Riverside when she was 15. That sale had separated her from her mother and two younger siblings. She had never seen any of them again. The loss had hollowed her out, left an emptiness she filled with work, with routine, with whatever small comforts she could find. A moment of rest, a full meal, the simple absence of pain. She had been paired with a field hand named Samuel, 20, 2 years old, strong and quiet. They shared a space in one of the quarter cabins. Their relationship was cordial without being close. Two people thrown together by someone else's decision, making the best of circumstances neither had chosen. When Deline discovered she was carrying a child, she felt a tangle of emotions. Fear, because pregnancy brought vulnerability and pain and the real possibility of death. But also a small, fragile hope. A child would be someone to love, someone who belonged to her, at least for a while before the plantation asserted its claim over that child too. The pregnancy progressed without complications. Deline continued her work in the laundry, hauling water, scrubbing clothes, hanging them out in the heavy air to dry. As her belly grew, the work grew harder, but she didn't complain. Complaining invited punishment. She gave birth in May of 1838, attended by the plantation midwife, a woman named Ruth. The labor ran long and difficult, stretching through the night and into the following day. But finally the baby came. A boy, healthy, crying hard. Ruth cleaned the infant and then stopped, her hands motionless, her face draining of color. "What is it?" Deline asked, exhausted, reaching for her son. "What's wrong?" Ruth didn't answer. She simply placed the baby in Deline's arms and stepped back, her expression deeply troubled. Deline looked down at her son and felt the world shift beneath her. The baby had blonde hair, blue eyes, and skin so pale it was nearly translucent. He looked nothing like her, nothing like Samuel, nothing like anyone in her family. "No," she breathed. "No, this can't." "Who's the father?" Ruth asked quietly. "Samuel. Samuel is the father. I haven't been with anyone else. I swear it." "Then how do you explain this child?" "I can't," Deline said, her tears falling freely now. "I can't explain it." Samuel was brought in from the fields to see his son. His reaction was immediate and cold with fury. He stared at the baby, then at Deline, and his face closed like a door being shut. "You've been with someone," he said flatly. "I haven't, Samuel, I swear." "Don't lie to me. Look at him. He has to be." "I haven't been with anyone else." "Then who?"
"Who did this? I don't know."
Deline sobbed. "I don't know." Samuel walked out of the cabin and didn't come back. He requested a transfer to a different crew, a different cabin. He never acknowledged the boy as his son. Gideon Frost heard about the birth within hours. He pushed into the cabin where Deline lay recovering, stared at the baby, and turned on her immediately. "Who's the father?" "Samuel," Deline whispered. "That is not Samuel's child. Look at it. I haven't been with anyone else."
"You're lying." "I'm not."
"I swear on my life." Frost questioned her for a full hour, his voice growing harsher, his threats more pointed. But Deline's account never shifted. She had been with no one but Samuel. She could not explain the child's features. She did not understand what had happened. Frost finally gave up and reported the situation to Browsard, who erupted with fury, directing it at Frost, accusing him of failing to maintain proper control, of allowing people to move freely, of neglecting his responsibilities. Frost defended himself, insisting that he ran a tight operation, that no outsider could have entered the quarters undetected. The argument went nowhere. In the end, Browsard ordered the birth recorded with Samuel listed as father, despite the obvious impossibility. The matter was to be considered closed, not discussed, forgotten. The baby was named Jean, and like Claire before him, he was a living impossibility, a child who had no right to exist. When word of Jean's birth reached Belmont, Vincent Habert felt a cold certainty take hold in his chest. This was not coincidence. This was not random genetic variation, resurfacing from some distant bloodline. Something deliberate was happening, and it was happening across multiple plantations. He pulled out his private journal and made a new entry, carefully noting Jean's birth date, the plantation, the mother's name, and the circumstances. He set this alongside his notes on Claire's birth and studied the two entries, searching for connections. Both mothers had been assigned to or near the main houses of their respective plantations. Marie had been called up from the fields to help with cleaning during a period when Belmont's regular house staff was short-handed. Deline already worked in the main house, but she had been given additional duties in the month before her pregnancy began, including night work, cleaning and preparing rooms after the family had retired for the evening. Habert felt his pulse quicken. Here was a pattern, a connection. It might turn out to mean nothing, or it might mean everything. He began making careful, quiet inquiries. He spoke to traders who traveled between plantations, asking offhand questions about births, about unusual occurrences, about whatever gossip they might have picked up. He listened carefully to conversations among enslaved people who had relatives on other properties, noting details, filing them away. And he waited, because if his suspicions were right, if this was a deliberate pattern rather than a series of accidents, then it would happen again. He was right. Over the following 2 years, 3 more children were born carrying the same impossible features. Each birth followed the same patterns. An enslaved mother with dark features, a recorded father who matched her appearance, and a child who looked nothing like either of them. The third child arrived at a plantation called Oakmont in November of 1838. The mother was a woman named Isabel, 25 years old, who worked in the main house as a cook's assistant. The baby was a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. Isabel insisted she had been with no one but her partner, a man named Gabriel. No one believed her, but no one could prove otherwise. The fourth child was born at a plantation called St. Clair in March of 1839. The mother was a woman named Ters, 19 years old, who had been brought up from the quarters to help serve at a dinner gathering 2 months before her pregnancy began. The baby was a boy with the same unmistakable features. Ters's partner, Antoine, refused to acknowledge the child. The fifth child came at a plantation called Magnolia Grove in September of 1839. The mother was a woman named Pauline, 22 years old, who worked in the laundry. She had been called up to the main house to help with cleaning during a period when the regular staff was occupied elsewhere. Her baby was a girl, blonde, blue-eyed. Her partner, a man named Louis, left her after the birth. Vincent Habert documented every birth in his private journal. He recorded the dates, the plantations, the mothers' names, and their work assignments. He drew up a map with each location marked. The plantations were spread across 3 parishes, but all fell within a 15-mile radius along the Mississippi River. He also noticed something else, something that had taken months to piece together carefully. A name that appeared in the background of each situation, never prominently, never in an obvious way, but always present. Dr. Marcus Levine. Levine was a physician, 42 years old, unmarried, and highly regarded throughout the parishes. He had been born in Louisiana to a French father and a Creole mother. At 18, he had been sent to Paris to study medicine, spending 8 years there before returning to Louisiana in 1825 to establish his practice. He was known for his skill, particularly in treating the fevers and infections that thrived in the humid Louisiana climate. He was also known for his discretion, his willingness to handle sensitive matters without spreading gossip, his capacity for keeping secrets. These qualities made him exceptionally popular among the planter families, who valued privacy almost above everything else. Levine served several plantations as their primary physician, traveling between them as the need arose. He treated planter families for their various ailments and also attended to enslaved people when the expense of medical care was justified by their value as property. A skilled laborer with a broken bone, a pregnant woman whose child represented future property, a house servant whose training made them worth preserving. These cases warranted the cost. Levine was also known for his striking appearance. He was tall and lean, with pale blonde hair worn slightly longer than fashion dictated, and eyes of an unusually piercing blue. He dressed well, but without ostentation, in dark suits that emphasized his coloring. He moved with a deliberate kind of grace and spoke quietly, never raising his voice, maintaining perfect composure at all times. Habert had encountered Levine several times over the years. The doctor had been called to Belmont to treat Madame Duchamp for a fever, to set a broken arm for a field hand injured during harvest, to attend to various minor ailments. He had found him professional, competent, and strangely cold. There was something about Levine that made Habert uneasy, though he had never been quite able to name it. Now, reviewing his notes, Habert saw the pattern with sudden clarity. Levine had been present at or near each plantation during the critical period before the pregnancies began. He had attended a social gathering at Belmont in December of 1836, 3 months before Marie conceived. He had been called to Riverside to treat Madame Brousard for a respiratory complaint in February of 1838. 3 months before Deline conceived, he had delivered a child for the owner's wife at Oakmont in August of 1838. 3 months before Isabel conceived, he had examined an injured worker at St. Clair in December of 1838. 3 months before Turs conceived, he had attended a dinner party at Magnolia Grove in June of 1839, 3 months before Pauline conceived. Always present, always in the background, always with access. Habert's hands were unsteady as he assembled these connections. He went through his notes again and again, checking dates, cross-referencing visits, searching for any flaw in his reasoning. But the pattern held firm. It was too precise to be coincidence, yet having a suspicion and proving it were entirely different matters. Habert had no direct evidence, no witnesses, no confession. He had only a pattern, a series of coincidences that seemed too exact to be accidental. He needed to speak with the women. If Levine was responsible, the women would know. They might not be able to speak openly. They might not be willing to name a white man, especially a respected doctor, but they would know. Habert started with Marie, since she was on his own plantation. He found her in the fields one afternoon working with a hoe, her daughter Claire strapped to her back in a cloth sling. Claire was 2 years old now, her blonde hair vivid in the sunlight. "Marie," Habert said quietly, approaching her. "I need to speak with you." Marie looked up, her expression guarded. "Yes, sir." "About Claire, about her father." Marie's face closed completely. "Thomas is her father, sir. That's what the records show. Marie, I know that isn't true, and I think you know it too." "I don't know what you mean, sir." "I think someone hurt you. Someone you had no power to refuse. Someone who had authority over you." Marie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said very softly, "Even if that were true, sir, what difference would it make? I'm property. Property can't be hurt. Property can't refuse. Property has no rights. Marie, I have nothing more to say, sir. Thomas is Claire's father. That's what the records show. She turned back to her work, and Habert knew he would get nothing further. The wall she had built around this secret was solid and impenetrable. He attempted the same conversation with the other women, traveling to the other plantations on various pretexts, finding moments to speak privately with Deline, with Isabel, with Ters, with Pauline. Every conversation followed the same course. The women maintained they had been with no one but their recorded partners. They had nothing further to say. The wall was always there. Habert understood. These women had no legal standing, no rights, no avenue for recourse. If they named a white man, especially a respected doctor, they would not be believed. They would be punished for lying, for causing trouble, for threatening the social order. Their children might be sold away from them. Their lives might become even more unbearable than they already were. Silence was the only protection available to them, however inadequate it was. Habert decided he needed to bring his findings to someone with actual authority, someone capable of acting on the information. He chose Judge Armand Thibault, a respected figure in St. James Parish. Thibault was 60 years old, a lawyer who had been appointed to the bench 15 years earlier. He was known within the constraints of the system for his fairness, his willingness to engage with difficult matters, his intelligence, and his personal integrity. Habert requested a meeting, and Thibault agreed to see him. They met in Thibault's office at the parish courthouse on a humid July afternoon in 1840. The office was lined with law books. Papers covered every available surface. Thibault sat behind his desk, a large man with graying hair and sharp, watchful eyes. Habert laid out his evidence with care. He showed Thibault the map with the plantations marked. He showed him the timeline with the dates of the births and the dates of Levine's visits. He walked through the pattern, the connections, the impossibility of coincidence. Thibault listened in complete silence, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Habert finished, Thibault leaned back in his chair and said nothing for a long moment. "This is a serious accusation," he said at last. "I know, sir. That's why I've brought it to you." "Do you have any direct evidence? Any testimony from the women?" "No, sir. They won't speak, or they can't. I've made every effort." Thibault stood and moved to his window, looking down at the street below. The courthouse stood in the center of the parish seat, a small town that served the surrounding plantations. The street was busy with afternoon activity. Wagons, horses, people going about their business. "You understand what you're implying?" Thibault said, his back still to Habert. "Dr. Levine is a respected member of this community. His family has been here for generations. His father was a prominent merchant. His mother came from one of the old Creole families. To accuse him of this without solid evidence would be devastating. It would ruin his reputation, his practice, his entire life." "I understand, sir, but the children exist. The pattern exists. 5 children in 2 years, all with the same impossible features. All born to mothers who had contact with Dr. Levine in the months before conception. Patterns can be coincidence. 5 times, sir, across 5 plantations, within 2 years, all connected to one man." Thibault turned back to face him. "Even assuming you're correct, even if Dr. Levine is responsible, what law has he broken? You've told me the women won't testify. Without their testimony there is no case. And even with their testimony," he left the sentence unfinished, and Habert understood what wasn't being said. Even with testimony, enslaved women had no legal standing. Their word would carry no weight against that of a white man, particularly a respected physician. The law did not recognize what had been done to them as a crime. "So there's nothing to be done?" Habert asked, hearing the bitterness in his own voice. "I didn't say that," Thibault replied. I'll make quiet inquiries. I'll speak to some of the plantation owners, ask questions, see what I can learn. But I want you to stop your investigation. If accusations start circulating without proof, the damage that follows may be impossible to contain. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. Go back to Bellamont. Say nothing to anyone. Leave this with me. Hebert left the courthouse with a mixture of relief and frustration in equal measure. He had done what he could. The matter was now in official hands. But he couldn't shake the conviction that nothing would come of it, that the truth would be buried beneath the weight of reputation and social position. He was right. Judge Thibault did make inquiries, but they were handled with such delicacy as to be nearly invisible. He met privately with 3 of the plantation owners. Carefully arranged meetings that left no public record. He asked vague questions about Levine's visits, about unusual occurrences, about the births of the distinctive-looking children. The responses were uniformly defensive. The plantation owners read the questions as attacks on their property values, their reputations, their standing in society. They insisted nothing unusual had occurred, nothing warranting investigation. The children were anomalies, genetic quirks, nothing more. Etienne Brauzard, owner of Riverside, was particularly hostile. He met Thibault in his study, a room dominated by a massive desk and ancestral portraits covering the walls. "Are you suggesting I don't know what happens on my own property?" he demanded, his face darkening with anger. "That I can't govern my own people. This is an insult, Armand. A deep insult. I'm not suggesting anything of the kind." Thibault replied evenly. "I'm following up on concerns that have been brought to my attention." "Concerns? What concerns?" "That some babies were born with lighter complexions. That happens sometimes. Mixed ancestry, distant bloodlines. It's not unusual. 5 babies in 2 years, Etienne. Across 5 different plantations, all bearing identical features. Coincidence. Nothing more. And all of their mothers had contact with Dr. Lavine in the months before conception." Brauzard's face shifted from flushed to pale. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a fact. Dr. Lavine is a man of honor. He has treated my family for years. He is above reproach. I'm sure he is. But the pattern." "There is no pattern." Brauzard cut him off. "There are coincidences, and I will not have you spreading rumors that could damage the reputation of a good man, or mine. Are we clear?" Thibault understood. Brauzard was more interested in suppressing scandal than in uncovering truth, more concerned with property values than with justice. Pushing further would make powerful enemies and accomplish nothing. The other plantation owners gave him essentially the same response. Defensive, hostile, unwilling to entertain the possibility that something wrong had occurred on their properties. To acknowledge that would mean acknowledging a failure of control, a failure of oversight, a crack in the foundation of the entire system. Within 2 weeks, Thibault sent word to Hebert that the inquiry was closed. Insufficient evidence to proceed. The matter was to be dropped. Hebert received the news with bitter resignation. He had expected it, but the confirmation still stung. He locked his notes in his desk and tried to return to his ordinary duties. But the births did not stop. In November of 1840, another child was born at a plantation called Sweetwater, 8 miles south of Bellamont. The property was smaller than most, specializing in indigo rather than sugar. Its owner was a widow, Madame Hebert, no relation to Vincent, who managed the operation with the help of her son. The mother was a woman named Cécile, 24 years old, who worked in the sugar house during grinding season and in the fields the rest of the year. The baby was a boy with blonde hair and blue eyes. Cécile's partner, a man named Joseph, refused to acknowledge the child. Dr. Lavine had been called to Sweetwater 3 months earlier to treat Madame Habert's son for a fever. He had stayed 2 days, sleeping in the guest room, taking his meals with the family. In March of 1841, another birth at Riverside. A different mother this time. A field hand named Lizette, 21 years old. The baby was a girl with the same unmistakable features. Lizette's partner, a man named Michel, left her following the birth. Dr. Levine had attended a social gathering at Riverside in December of 1840. In August of 1841, another birth at Oakmont. The mother was a woman named Margot, 23 years old, who worked in the main house. The baby was a boy. Margot's partner, Henry, refused to speak to her afterward. Dr. Levine had been called to Oakmont to treat an injured field hand in May of 1841. In January of 1842, another birth at a plantation called Cypress Point, 10 miles north of Bellamont. The mother was a woman named Adele, 20 years old. The baby was a girl. Adele's partner, Francois, requested a transfer to a different plantation. Dr. Levine had attended a dinner party at Cypress Point in October of 1841. The pattern continued, relentless and undeniable. Vincent Habert documented each birth in his private journal. Even having been told to abandon his investigation, he found he couldn't. The pattern was too clear, too deliberate. 9 children now, all carrying the same impossible features, all connected to Dr. Levine. And with each new birth, the whispers grew louder. The enslaved community knew something was deeply wrong. They could not speak openly, could not make accusations, could not demand justice. But they knew. And they began to protect themselves the only way available to them. Women started refusing assignments to the main houses. They claimed illness, injury, any excuse to avoid being called up from the quarters. When pressed, they became unresponsive, resistant, uncooperative. Overseers noticed the resistance and responded with punishment. Women were whipped for refusing work assignments, for feigning illness, for insubordination. But the resistance continued. The women seemed prepared to absorb punishment, rather than risk being sent to the main houses. This created serious operational problems. House servants were essential to the functioning of the main households. Laundry had to be done. Meals had to be prepared. Rooms had to be cleaned. When women refused these assignments, the work fell to others, generating resentment and disruption throughout the quarters. The tension on the plantations became something you could feel in the air. Productivity dropped. Small acts of defiance multiplied. Tools breaking, work slowing, minor acts of sabotage that couldn't be directly attributed to anyone but accumulated into significant disruption. Plantation owners blamed their overseers for losing control. Overseers blamed the enslaved workers for laziness and rebelliousness. Nobody wanted to name the actual cause, except Vincent Habert. He saw clearly what was happening, understood the fear driving it. The women were protecting themselves in the only way they could, through resistance and refusal, even when it cost them dearly. And he made a decision that would change everything. He began documenting the births again, but this time he didn't keep the information locked away. He shared it, carefully, selectively, with other overseers, with traders, with anyone who might listen. He created copies of his map, his timeline, his evidence linking Levine to each incident. He understood the danger he was placing himself in. He understood he was risking his position and possibly more. But he could no longer remain silent. The pattern was too clear. The injustice was too great. The suffering was too profound. The information moved slowly at first, then with gathering speed. Overseers compared notes. Traders carried the story from one plantation to the next, from one parish to the next. Whispers became conversations. Conversations became discussions. By the summer of 1842, the story had spread throughout all 3 parishes. It was spoken of in hushed exchanges in plantation offices, in carefully worded letters between owners, in the guarded language of people who understood. They were approaching something explosive. The plantation owners tried to suppress it, but it was already too late. Too many people knew. The scandal was becoming public, and finally, inevitably, the story reached Dr. Marcus Levine himself. Levine's response was not what anyone had anticipated. He did not deny the accusations. He did not flee. He showed no trace of shame or fear. Instead, in September of 1842, he called a meeting. He sent formal invitations to the owners of all the affected plantations, asking them to gather at his home on a Thursday evening. He also invited Judge Thibault, several other prominent citizens, and, notably, Vincent Habert. The invitations were courteous but firm. Levine wrote that he was aware certain questions had been circulating about specific matters, and he wished to address these questions directly and thoroughly. He requested the courtesy of a hearing. Before any further action was taken, the plantation owners were caught off balance by this. Such an invitation was unusual, almost without precedent. But curiosity won out, and they agreed to attend. They wanted to know what Levine planned to say, how he intended to defend himself. Habert received his invitation with a cold, sinking feeling. He didn't know what Levine was planning, but he knew it wouldn't be reassuring. The meeting convened on a Thursday evening, September 15, 1842. The air was dense with humidity and the approaching threat of rain. 15 men gathered at Levine's house, a modest but well-appointed residence on the edge of the parish seat, built in the American style with a symmetrical facade and a central hallway. Levine greeted each guest personally as they arrived, shaking hands, making small talk, performing the role of gracious host with perfect ease. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes clear and untroubled. He displayed no anxiety whatsoever. When everyone had arrived, Levine led them to his parlor, a room arranged with comfortable chairs in a semicircle. A sideboard held decanters of whiskey and brandy, glasses, and cigars. Levine invited the men to help themselves to settle in. The atmosphere was surreal. It felt like a social gathering rather than a reckoning. The men sat in uneasy silence, waiting. Levine stood before them, completely composed, holding a glass of brandy. He took a small sip before he began to speak. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice quiet but perfectly audible. "I understand there have been questions circulating about certain births that have occurred over the past several years. Questions about the appearance of these children, about their parentage, about my possible involvement." The room was absolutely still. Every eye was on Levine. "I want to address these questions directly and honestly," he continued. "I believe clarity is preferable to rumor, that truth is preferable to speculation. So let me be clear." He paused. "Yes, I am the father of these children, all of them." The silence shattered. Men shouted and rose to their feet. Judge Thibault called for order, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. Browsard was standing, his face congested with rage. Duchamp looked as though he might lose consciousness. Levine waited, patient, taking another sip of brandy, until the room gradually subsided. "I understand your shock," he said when he could be heard again. "But before you judge me, I ask that you hear my explanation. What I have done with purpose, and with what I believe to be sound reasoning." "Sound reasoning?" Browsard erupted. "You've violated." "I have conducted an experiment," Levine said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. "A scientific experiment that I believe carries profound implications for our understanding of human heredity and racial characteristics." The room went silent again, but with a different quality now. Confused, horrified, Levine crossed to a desk in the corner and lifted a leather-bound journal. He held it up so every man in the room could see it. For the past 7 years. He said, I have been investigating the question of racial inheritance. Specifically, I wish to determine whether the physical characteristics we associate with race are fixed and immutable, or whether they can be altered through selective breeding. He opened the journal, fanning pages densely covered with notes, diagrams, measurements, and observations. The handwriting was neat and precise, the work of someone who took considerable pride in documentation. I theorized. Levine continued, that by introducing European genetic material into the African population, I could produce offspring displaying European features. The children born over these past years have confirmed my hypothesis. Regardless of the mother's appearance, my genetic contribution has dominated, producing children with blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair skin. Vincent Habert felt physically ill. Around him, other men showed similar responses. Pale faces, clenched jaws, hands gripping chair arms. The casual, measured way Levine discussed human beings, women, children, was more profoundly disturbing than any display of rage or defensiveness would have been. You're talking about human beings, Thibault said, his voice unsteady. Not livestock, not laboratory specimens. Human beings. Am I? Levine asked, turning toward the judge. His expression was one of genuine intellectual curiosity, as though this were an interesting philosophical puzzle worth exploring. The law of this state says otherwise, Judge Thibault. The law defines these women as property. The law defines their children as property. I have violated no statute, broken no law. I have simply made use of available resources in the pursuit of scientific knowledge. You've committed rape? Habert said. The word hung in the room like smoke. Multiple times. Against women who had no capacity to refuse you, no means of protecting themselves. Levine turned to face him. His expression remained unchanged. Rape is a crime committed against persons, Mr. Habert. These women are not legally persons. They are property. I no more committed rape than a farmer commits rape when he manages the breeding of his cattle. The law is unambiguous on this point. The logic was monstrous. It was also legally accurate. Louisiana law in 1842 did not extend to enslaved people any legal standing to be victims of rape. They were property, and property could not be violated. The law existed to protect property owners against theft or damage, but not to protect the property itself from the actions of others. Several of the plantation owners looked visibly uncomfortable, but none challenged Levine's legal reasoning. To do so would be to challenge the entire legal and social architecture that sustained their way of life. If enslaved people were persons with rights, then slavery itself became indefensible. Why? Duchamp asked at last, his voice barely above a whisper. Why do this? What did you hope to gain? Knowledge. Levine replied simply, understanding. I wish to demonstrate that racial characteristics are not fixed, that they can be altered through selective breeding. The implications of this extend to everything, to slavery, to colonization, to the entire future trajectory of human civilization. He moved back to the center of the room, his journal still in hand, and his voice took on an almost evangelical quality. Consider the possibilities. If we can alter racial traits through selective breeding, we can reshape entire populations. We can produce workers ideally suited to specific climates and forms of labor. We can eliminate undesirable traits and cultivate desirable ones. We can engineer the future of humanity itself. You're insane, someone said quietly. I'm a scientist, Levine replied. And my experiment has succeeded. The children exist. The evidence is irrefutable. I have demonstrated that European characteristics dominate African characteristics in mixed offspring. This is valuable knowledge. Gentlemen, knowledge that could meaningfully advance our understanding of human biology, of heredity, of the very nature of race. Judge Thibault stood. His face was flushed with anger and something deeper. Revulsion, perhaps, at what he was hearing, at what he was being forced to reckon with. "Dr. Levine," he said, his voice hard. "Whatever legal technicalities may apply, what you have done is morally reprehensible. You have caused immeasurable suffering to women who had no ability to refuse you. You have destroyed families. You have disrupted multiple plantations. You have created a scandal that will damage this entire region." "I have created knowledge," Levine replied without effect. "What you choose to do with that knowledge is your concern, not mine. I have documented everything in this journal and in others. My methods, my observations, my conclusions. This record will be of value to future scientists, to future generations who wish to build on this work." "You will leave this parish," Thibault said. "You will end your practice here, sell your property, and go. If you refuse, I will find a way to bring charges. Legal technicalities be damned. I will make your continued presence here impossible." Levine smiled slightly. The smile was somehow the most disturbing thing in a room already filled with disturbing things. "I have already made arrangements to leave, Judge Thibault. My work here is complete. I have gathered sufficient data. I am relocating to Texas, where I intend to continue my research on a larger scale. The frontier offers opportunities that are not available in more settled regions." "Get out," Browsard said, his voice trembling with fury. "Get out of this parish. Get out of Louisiana. And if I ever see your face again, I will kill you myself." Levine set down his brandy glass and inclined his head slightly, as though acknowledging a pleasantry. "I'll be gone within the week," he said. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen. I felt it was important that you understand the truth of what has occurred. Rumor and speculation serve no one." The meeting broke apart into angry recriminations, threats, and arguments. But in the end, there was nothing to be done. Levine had broken no law. He could not be prosecuted, could not be formally punished. The system that should have protected the women he had violated had instead shielded him perfectly. Within 2 weeks he was gone. His house sold to a merchant from New Orleans. His practice transferred to another doctor. His belongings packed and shipped. He vanished into the expanding American frontier, taking his journals, his data, and his monstrous certainty along with him. The aftermath of Levine's confession spread through the parishes like fever. The plantation owners worked to suppress the story, but it was far too late. Too many people already knew. The scandal became common currency, discussed in New Orleans parlors, in riverboat saloons, in the careful letters that traveled between planter families across Louisiana and beyond. The children remained, of course. 13 of them by the time Levine departed, ranging from newborn to 5 years old. They grew up in the quarters, marked by their appearance, living proof of what had been done to their mothers. The mothers navigated their children's existence in different ways. Some, like Marie, worked at loving these children despite the weight of everything attached to them. Marie held Claire close, sang to her, shielded her as best she could. But there was always a distance she couldn't fully close, a wall that wouldn't come down. Every time she looked at Claire, she encountered the violation, the helplessness, the night that had redefined her life. Others found it impossible to look at their children at all. Deline at Riverside became withdrawn and wordless after Jean's birth. She cared for him in a purely mechanical way, feeding him, keeping him clean, but offered no warmth. When he reached for her, she turned away. When he cried, she handed him to another woman to comfort. The children sensed this rejection. Even as infants, they grew up understanding they were different, that their existence caused pain in those closest to them. The men who had been recorded as fathers, The men who had been partners to these women responded with anger and abandonment. Thomas never acknowledged Claire. Samuel never acknowledged Jean. Neither did Gabriel, Antoine, Louis, Joseph, Michel, Henry, Francois, nor any of the others. These men had been placed in relationships they hadn't chosen, had found small measures of comfort within them, and had watched those fragile bonds disintegrate. The women were left alone, raising children who looked nothing like them, children who were permanent reminders of violation and powerlessness. The enslaved community remained divided. Some people extended sympathy to the mothers, recognizing that something terrible had been done to them, helping where they could, watching the strange-looking children, sharing food, offering what small comfort was available. Others held suspicion, believing the mothers must have been willing, must somehow have brought this on themselves. They spread rumors, withheld acceptance, kept a certain distance. The children grew up inside this atmosphere of division and unease, neither fully embraced nor fully excluded, occupying a liminal space within the quarters. As they got older, their appearance became even more startling. By the time Claire reached 5, she looked like a child transplanted from Northern Europe. Her hair was long and blonde, her eyes that sharp winter blue, her skin pale and quick to burn in the Louisiana sun. She stood out among the other children with a kind of impossible visibility. The same was true of all of Lavigne's children. They were beautiful by the standards of conventional European aesthetics, and this beauty made them valuable in a particular and terrible way. As they aged, some were sold to traders who specialized in what were politely called fancy girls. Enslaved women with light complexions sold for sexual exploitation. The boys were sometimes retained as house servants, their appearance making them suitable for positions where they would be visible to guests. This was another layer of horror layered onto the first. Lavigne's experiment had not only violated the mothers, it had produced children who would themselves be exploited because of the very features that set them apart. Vincent Habert continued as overseer at Bellemont for 3 more years after Lavigne's departure, but he found it increasingly difficult to remain in his position. Every day he watched Claire growing up. Every day he witnessed Marie's pain. Every day he lived inside the evidence of a crime that carried no legal name and offered no possibility of justice. In 1845 he resigned and moved to New Orleans. He found work as a clerk in a shipping office, a position that paid less but allowed him to sleep through the night. He brought his journals with him, the careful years-long record of everything that had happened. Years later, in 1867, after the Civil War had ended and slavery had been abolished, Habert donated his journals to a historical society. He wrote a cover letter explaining what the documents contained, why he had maintained them, what they represented. These records, he wrote, document a crime that was not legally a crime, a violation that was not legally a violation, suffering that was not legally suffering. They show how a system designed to treat human beings as property created conditions in which the most monstrous acts could be committed without consequence. I kept these records because I believed that someday someone would want to know the truth, that someday the truth would matter. The journals were filed away in an archive, rarely examined. A testament to a crime that was never officially named. Judge Thibault had attempted to pursue legal action against Lavigne, but every attorney he consulted offered the same answer. There was no case. No law had been broken. The women had no legal standing to bring charges. The plantation owners had no grounds for complaint since their property had not been damaged in any legally recognized sense. Thibault spent months searching, consulting law books, writing to colleagues in other states, seeking any possible avenue for prosecution. The answer was always the same. Under Louisiana law in 1842, what Levine had done was not a crime. This realization haunted Thibault for the rest of his life. He had spent his career placing faith in the law, believing that the legal system, however imperfect, served justice in some meaningful way. Levine's case forced him to confront a harder truth, that the law itself could be unjust, that a legal system built on the premise that some human beings were property could never deliver justice to those people. Thibault retired from the bench in 1850, citing health. He died in 1855. Those who had known him said he had never been quite the same after the Levine affair. As for Dr. Marcus Levine, he did relocate to Texas, where he established a new medical practice in a growing frontier settlement, and continued his research for at least another decade, according to fragmentary surviving records. There are traces in letters, in birth records, in the recollections of people who lived in that town, suggesting the pattern continued. More children with impossible features. More women who could not speak of what had been done to them. Levine died in 1856, apparently from natural causes at the age of 56. His executor, a lawyer managing his affairs, discovered the journals among his effects. He read them. He was horrified by their contents, and he made the decision to destroy them. He burned every journal, every page of notes, every piece of documentation connected to Levine's experiments. Some knowledge, the lawyer wrote in his own diary, is too dangerous to preserve. Some truths are too monstrous to pass on to future generations. I have destroyed Dr. Levine's work, not to protect his reputation, but to protect humanity from the ideas contained within those pages. But the children remained. The evidence of Levine's experiments lived on in the faces of 13 children in Louisiana and an unknown number in Texas. These children grew up, had children of their own, passed on the genes that Levine had introduced into their family lines. When the Civil War came and slavery ended, these children, now adults, faced a different set of challenges. Too white in appearance to move easily through black communities, too black by law and by heritage to be received into white society. They existed in a liminal space, belonging nowhere, their very existence a continuing reminder of the horrors that had produced them. Some attempted to pass as white, abandoning their families and their histories, constructing new identities in new places. For those with the lightest skin and the most European features, this was possible. They disappeared into white society, married white partners, raised children who never learned the truth of their heritage. Others stayed within black communities, accepting their outsider status, building lives despite the suspicion and unanswered questions that followed them. They married, had children, created families. Sometimes their children resembled them. Blonde, blue-eyed, pale. Sometimes the African features reasserted themselves, producing children who looked more like their grandmothers than their parents. The genetic legacy of Levine's experiments carried forward through generations. Even today, more than 180 years later, there are families in Louisiana who occasionally bring a blonde-haired, blue-eyed child into the world despite predominantly African ancestry. Most have no knowledge of the full story behind their heritage. The details were buried, forgotten, or deliberately erased. But the story remains, documented in those old ledgers, in Habbert's careful notes, in the birth records that map an impossible pattern across 3 Louisiana parishes. A reminder that the horrors of slavery were not only about physical brutality or economic exploitation. They were about the complete and systematic dehumanization of human beings. The reduction of people to property, to experimental subjects, to things that could be used and discarded without consequence. Louisiana kept recording those births. kept noting the impossible pattern. 13 children across 7 years, all with blonde hair and blue eyes, all born to enslaved women with dark features, all fathered by one man who regarded them not as human beings, but as data points in an ongoing study. The system that should have protected their mothers, that should have punished their father, that should have called the crime what it was, failed completely, because in 1842 Louisiana, enslaved women were not persons. They were property, and property could not be raped, could not be violated, could not demand justice. That was the true horror. Not the births themselves, but the legal and social structure that made them possible and then protected the man who had engineered them. The horror was the system that permitted a respected doctor to conduct experiments on human beings without consent, to violate women who had no avenue of recourse, to bring children into the world who would grow up permanently marked by their origins, and to walk away without facing any consequence. The children were evidence of something, but evidence of what? Of a crime with no name, no legal recognition, no possibility of prosecution. They were living proof that the system was operating precisely as it had been designed, to protect the powerful and to strip the powerless of their humanity. Vincent Habert understood this. In his final journal entry, written in 1867 before he donated his records to the Historical Society, he wrote, "I have spent 25 years attempting to understand what happened in those Louisiana parishes between 1837 and 1844. I have documented the births, traced the pattern, identified the perpetrator, and placed the evidence before those with the power to act. And I have learned that sometimes the greatest crimes are those that are perfectly legal. That sometimes the most profound injustice is built directly into the structure of the law itself." Dr. Lavigne committed no crime under Louisiana law. He violated no statute. He broke no rule. He simply used the system as it was designed to be used, treating human beings as property, as resources, as subjects for experimentation. The law protected him because the law was written to protect men like him. The real crime was not what Dr. Lavigne did to those women, though that was monstrous enough. The real crime was the system that made it possible, the law that denied those women any legal standing, any rights, any recourse. The real crime was slavery itself. I kept these records because I believed that someday the truth would matter. That someday people would want to know what happened, would want to understand how such things were possible. I kept them as a warning, as a reminder, as evidence of what follows when we deny the humanity of other human beings. The children born from Dr. Lavigne's experiments are now adults. They carry the mark of their origins in their features, in the genes they will pass to their own children. They are living reminders of a crime that had no name, a violation with no legal recognition, suffering that was not legally suffering. I hope that those who come after will read these records and understand. I hope they will see the truth of what happened here and resolve that such things must never be permitted again. I hope they will build a society in which all human beings are recognized as persons, in which all people hold rights, in which the law protects the vulnerable rather than the powerful. That is my hope. But I am not optimistic, because I have seen how easily we deny the humanity of others, how quickly we justify the unjustifiable, how readily we accept systems that benefit us at the expense of someone else. These records are my testimony. This is what I witnessed. This is what happened. May God have mercy on us all. This story illuminates one of the darkest dimensions of American history, the absolute legal vulnerability of enslaved people, and the conditions that allowed power to be abused without any possibility of consequence. The case of Dr. Marcus Lavigne and the 13 children born from his experiments demonstrates how a system founded on the premise that certain human beings are property created conditions in which the most undeserved acts could be carried out without any legal repercussion whatsoever. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe there are other stories like this one, buried or forgotten somewhere in American history? Leave your thoughts in the comments below and share your perspective. If you found this story as disturbing and as important as I did, please hit the like button, share this video with someone who values historical truth, and subscribe to this channel for more in-depth explorations of America's hidden past. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.